The envelope came on a Tuesday. Russell Hadley pulled it out of the mailbox at the end of his lane along with a seed catalog and an electric bill, and he carried all three up to the house without looking at any of them, because he had carried mail up that lane for 48 years, and very little of it had ever surprised him. He set the stack on the kitchen counter. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat down. Then he opened the envelope. It was from Cornerstone Federal Bank. The letter inside was one page. It said that the property at 4418 County Road North in Greene County, Missouri, Russell Hadley's farm, had been sold to a corporate buyer the previous Friday for the sum of $1, in satisfaction of a deficiency judgment from a 1962 loan default by a previous owner of the parcel. The transfer of title was complete. Russell had 30 days to vacate. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set the paper down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall. He sat there a long time. The coffee got cold. After a while, he got up and went out the back door and walked across the yard to the small white shed where his wife, Doris, had kept her garden tools. The shed had not been opened in 3 years. He stood at the door for a minute with his hand on the latch. Then he opened it. The metal box was inside, on a shelf, exactly where Doris had left it. Russell Hadley was 76 years old. He had lived on the same 80 acres in southwest Missouri for 61 years, since the day in 1965 when an old man named Tobias Greer had handed him the deed and said, "It's yours now. You keep working it." The story of how Russell came to own that 80 acres was a story most people in Greene County had heard at least once. Tobias Greer had no children. His wife had died in 1953. He had farmed his 80 acres alone after that, getting up at 4:30 in the morning the way he had always done, and by the early 60s he was 78 years old, and his hands had begun to shake. Russell Hadley was 15 the first time he walked over from his parents' rented house and asked Tobias if he needed help with anything. Russell's father was a tenant farmer who never owned an acre in his life, and Russell knew, even at 15, that he was not going to inherit a single thing from his own father except a worn-out pair of boots and a name. He worked for Tobias on Saturdays for 2 years for 50 cents an hour. Then he started staying after school. Then he stayed through the summer. By the time he was 18, he was running the farm, and Tobias was sitting on the porch with a blanket on his lap. In 1965, Tobias called Russell into the kitchen and handed him a folded paper. He said, "I had Mr. Calloway draw this up. The land is yours. The condition is you keep working it. Don't sell it. Don't lease it out and let someone else farm it. You work it yourself, or your family works it until you can't. That's the only thing I'm asking." Russell had asked what the price was. Tobias had said, $1, so it's legal. Russell had pulled a dollar bill out of his pocket and put it on the kitchen table. Tobias had folded it into his shirt and not said anything else about it. 6 months later, Tobias died of a heart attack in the barn while feeding his last steer. The contract was in the metal box. Russell had not looked at it in 61 years. The metal box on the shelf in Doris's garden shed was a green Army surplus ammunition box that Russell's father had bought at a sale in 1957. Doris had taken it over in 1969, the year after they were married, and had used it for the next 50 years to store every important paper that crossed their kitchen table. The box was organized by year. The folders inside were labeled in her handwriting, in pencil, on the tabs. Russell had not opened it since the funeral. He carried the box back to the kitchen. He set it on the table beside the letter from Cornerstone Federal. He sat down. He undid the latch. The folders were arranged by decade. Doris had kept everything, every tax receipt, every fence permit, every doctor's bill from 1969 forward. Russell did not know what he was looking for exactly, but he knew where to start. He pulled out the folder labeled 1965. The contract was the first document inside. 3 pages. Typewriter ink, faded but legible. The header at the top read, "Agreement of Sale and Conveyance," and below that, in smaller type, "Greene County, Missouri, September 14, 1965. The seller was Tobias Earl Greer. The buyer was Russell James Hadley. The consideration was $1. Russell read the first page. Then he read the second. Then, at the top of the third, he found the paragraph he had not remembered because he had been 20 years old when he signed it and had not understood what it said. The paragraph was titled, Warranty of Title. It read that Tobias Earl Greer warranted to Russell James Hadley that the property described in the agreement was free and clear of all liens, encumbrances, and outstanding claims, and that any subsequent claim against the property predating the date of conveyance would be the sole responsibility of the seller's estate, with the buyer held harmless and indemnified in perpetuity. Russell read it 3 times. Then he picked up the phone and called his lawyer. His lawyer was a woman named Patricia Lynn, who was 52 years old and ran a 3-person office in Springfield, Missouri. She had handled Russell's affairs since Doris's estate in 2022. He read her the letter from Cornerstone Federal. He read her the warranty of title paragraph. There was a long pause on the line.
Russell,
She said, I want you to come into my office tomorrow. Bring the box. Bring everything in it from 1965 forward. Can they do this? Can they sell my farm for $1? Russell, I have to tell you the truth. If a deficiency judgment from 1962 was on file against the previous owner, and that judgment was never satisfied, and the bank found it during a portfolio review, yes, technically in some jurisdictions they can. The 1965 contract is a strong defense, but these old judgments are tricky. We're going to have to fight. All right. And Russell, there's something else I should tell you. Yes. Whoever bought your farm for $1, that's a corporate buyer. The bank wouldn't sell to a corporate buyer for $1 unless somebody set this up in advance. This isn't a clerical error, this is a deal. Russell was quiet on the line. All right, he said. I'll come in tomorrow. The bank's lawyer was a man named Harlan Voss. He was 58 years old, a senior partner at a firm in Kansas City, and he had handled deficiency recoveries for Cornerstone Federal for 22 years. He wore 3-piece suits in court and a wedding ring he had not removed since 1991. He had a reputation in Missouri for being the sort of attorney who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to. The corporate buyer of Russell Hadley's farm was a Delaware LLC called Heartland Acquisitions Group. It had been incorporated 4 months before the auction. Its sole listed officer was a paralegal in Voss's firm. The deficiency judgment from 1962 was real. It had been filed against Tobias Greer in May of 1962 by a feed and seed dealer named Holcomb, who had been owed $3,420 for unpaid winter purchases. Holcomb had died in 1971 without collecting. The judgment had been transferred between debt-buying firms 3 times in the next 5 decades and had eventually landed in the long-tail recovery portfolio of Cornerstone Federal Bank, which had acquired it in 2018 in a bulk purchase of legacy receivables. The portfolio had sat untouched until Harlan Voss's firm had been retained in late 2025 to review it. Voss had identified 17 properties in southwest Missouri where the original judgment debtors were deceased and the current property owners were over the age of 70. He had filed for foreclosure auction on all 17. He had spent, according to billing records that were later subpoenaed, 36 minutes on the Hadley file before authorizing the sale. 36 minutes to undo 61 years. The mediation was scheduled for the 2nd week of June. Patricia Lynn had pushed for mediation rather than full litigation because the cost of a contested federal case would have eaten up Russell's savings inside of 6 months, and because she believed, though she did not tell Russell this for several weeks, that the 1965 contract was strong enough to win in any room where someone took the time to read it. The mediation room was on the 3rd floor of a small office building in Springfield. It was carpeted, beige, with a long oak table and 8 chairs. The mediator was a retired circuit judge named Francis Whitcomb, who had been on the bench for 31 years and who handled most of the agricultural disputes in southwest Missouri after her retirement. She was 68. She had grown up on a dairy farm in Polk County. She did not waste words. Russell arrived at 9:30 in the morning in a clean white shirt that Doris had ironed in 2019 and that he had kept in the closet for the rest of his life for occasions that required it. He carried the metal box. Patricia Lynn sat beside him. Harlan Voss arrived at 9:45 with 2 associates and a leather folio. He nodded politely at Russell. He did not extend his hand. The mediation began at 10. Voss spoke first. He spoke for 22 minutes. He laid out the chain of title on the 1962 deficiency judgment. He explained the bank's good faith efforts at notification. He acknowledged that Mr. Hadley had been an unfortunate downstream beneficiary of a flawed conveyance in 1965. Those were the words he used, unfortunate downstream beneficiary, and he proposed a settlement. The bank would reverse the sale to Heartland Acquisitions Group. The bank would offer Mr. Hadley the opportunity to repurchase his farm at a fair market value of $410,000, financed at a competitive rate over 15 years. He called it a generous resolution. He used the phrase legacy artifact to describe the 1965 contract. He used it twice. When he was done, he closed his folio. Patricia Lynn stood. She did not have notes. "Judge Whitcomb," she said, "we have one document to present." She walked to the head of the table and laid the 1965 contract in front of the mediator. She turned to page 3. She placed her finger on the warranty of title paragraph. This contract was signed 61 years ago by Tobias Greer, who at the time of signing held undisputed title to the property. The contract warrants Mr. Hadley against any prior claim against the parcel and indemnifies him in perpetuity. The 1962 judgment Mr. Voss has described is precisely the kind of prior claim this paragraph addresses. The bank's recourse, if any exists, is against the estate of Tobias Greer. It is not against my client. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Frances Whitcomb read the paragraph. She read the second page. She read the first page. She read it all the way through, from the top, in silence, while everyone in the room sat and waited. It took her about 4 minutes. When she finished, she set the contract down. She looked at Voss. "Counselor," she said, "did your firm review this document before authorizing the sale of Mr. Hadley's farm to Heartland Acquisitions Group?" Voss hesitated. "Your Honor, Judge Whitcomb, the 1965 conveyance was reviewed in summary form. The warranty paragraph was noted but considered—" "Considered what?" "Considered, given the age and the circumstances, to be a legacy artifact of a private agreement between Mr. Greer and Mr. Hadley, not enforceable against a subsequent good faith purchaser of the underlying claim." "Mr. Voss," she said, "I have been reading land contracts in Greene County for 40 years. This warranty is not a legacy artifact. It is enforceable. It was enforceable in 1965. It is enforceable today. Your client does not have a claim against Mr. Hadley. Your client has a claim against the estate of Tobias Greer, who has been dead since 1966. She looked at the contract again. She slid it across the table back to Patricia Lynn. "I am recommending that the parties resolve this matter today, in this room, on the following terms. The sale to Heartland Acquisitions Group is rescinded. Title to the farm is restored to Mr. Hadley free and clear. Cornerstone Federal Bank will pay Mr. Hadley damages in the amount of $240,000 for wrongful sale. Cornerstone Federal will additionally cover Mr. Hadley's legal fees, which I estimate at $35,000. The bank will issue a written acknowledgement that the 1962 judgment is uncollectible against the parcel, and Mr. Voss's firm will recuse itself from any further action against any of the 17 Missouri property owners currently in this portfolio." She looked at Voss. "Do you need to make a phone call before you agree, Counselor?" Voss looked at his associates. He looked at the contract on the table. He picked up his phone and stepped into the hall. He came back in 11 minutes. He sat down. He said, "We accept." Russell did not say anything. He looked at Patricia. He looked at the metal box. He nodded once. The papers were signed at 2:15 in the afternoon. Russell drove home alone. He stopped at the small grocery in town on the way back, the way he stopped every Tuesday, and he bought a quart of milk and a loaf of bread and a small bag of sugar, because he was almost out of sugar, and Doris had always said that running out of sugar in the middle of a week was the kind of thing that meant a man wasn't paying attention. When he got home, he carried the groceries inside and put them away. He set the milk in the refrigerator. He set the bread in the bread box. He set the sugar in the canister on the counter. The canister was a ceramic one Doris had bought at a church sale in 1981, with a small painted rooster on the lid. He stood at the counter for a minute with his hand on the lid of the canister. Then he picked up the phone and called his daughter, who lived in Tulsa. "Hi, Dad," she said. "How are you?" "I'm all right. I just wanted to call. How was your day?" "It was a long day, but it was a good one." She laughed at something on her end of the line. He could hear one of his grandchildren in the background asking her something about dinner. He listened to the small, ordinary sound of his daughter's life going on. He did not tell her in that phone call anything about the bank or the contract or the mediation. He would tell her later when he had the words for it. For now, he just wanted to hear her voice. He talked to her for 11 minutes. Then he hung up. He stood at the window and looked out at the south pasture for a long time. The metal box went back to the shelf in Doris's garden shed. Russell closed the latch. He shut the door. He walked back across the yard to the house in the late afternoon light, the way he had walked back across that yard for 61 years, because Tobias Greer had handed him a piece of paper in 1965, and he had honored what was on it, and because Doris Hadley had spent 50 years organizing every paper that ever crossed their kitchen table, and because the people who love you the most are sometimes the ones who keep things you don't yet know you'll need. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. You understand what it means to keep your word for 61 years, and you understand what it means to leave behind a metal box that protects somebody after you're gone. Next time, we'll meet a man named Wendell Crow in eastern Tennessee who came home from the hospital to find a survey crew on his property and a yellow stake driven into his front yard. What he found in his father's old workshop changed everything. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Paste your script.